3 police cruisers harass a disabled black teen in his wheelchair outside the library, their hands already on their weapons, thinking they've found an easy target to intimidate. As they begin their illegal search, throwing his law books to the ground, Marcus recites statute after statute with unwavering precision. The lead officer's face twists from arrogant to uncertain. This isn't going according to plan. When Marcus calmly quotes a federal court precedent that matches their misconduct word for word, everything changes. These corrupt cops are about to learn a harsh lesson. They didn't just pick on a disabled teen, they've awakened a legal prodigy who's been preparing for this moment his entire life. But how far will these officers go to cover up their actions? And when Marcus starts connecting the dots to years of similar incidents, will his brilliant mind be enough to survive what he's about to uncover? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The familiar weight of law books settled across Marcus's lap as he wheeled through the grand doors of the Central Library 6 hours before the confrontation. Ms. Chen, the head librarian, greeted him with her usual warm smile and knowing look. For the past 3 years, since the accident that took his ability to walk, this had been his sanctuary, his training ground, his battlefield of choice. Constitutional law today? Ms. Chen asked, noting the stack of books already piled on his study table in the corner. The morning light streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. And civil rights precedents, Marcus replied, his fingers tracing the spine of a worn volume. His mind flashed back to the hospital bed where it all began. Lying there at 14, listening to doctors tell his mother he'd never walk again, he'd made a decision. If his legs couldn't carry him forward, his mind would have to do the heavy lifting. The memories came in waves. The drunk driver who'd changed everything. The endless hours of physical therapy. His mother, Sandra, working double shifts at the hospital to cover the medical bills. Coming home exhausted but never too tired to quiz him on his latest legal studies. She'd been confused at first when he'd asked for law books instead of video games, but she saw something in his eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Marcus's photographic memory had always been his secret weapon. Before the accident, it had made him a stellar student. After, it became his armor. Every statute, every precedent, every judicial opinion he read burned itself into his mind with perfect clarity. While other kids his age were learning to drive, he was memorizing Supreme Court decisions. While they went to parties, he was building a fortress of legal knowledge. His fingers moved across the pages with practiced precision, his mind cataloging each new piece of information. Today's focus: civil rights violations and police misconduct cases. Not because he expected trouble, but because his mother had taught him that knowledge was the best defense in a world that wouldn't always be fair to a young black man in a wheelchair. "You've read more case law than most first-year law students," Ms. Chen commented, bringing him a glass of water. She'd watched him grow from a broken teenager into something extraordinary. "But you never told me why you chose this path." Marcus looked up from his books, his dark eyes carrying wisdom far beyond his 17 years. "Because justice doesn't just happen, Ms. Chen. It needs to be understood before it can be demanded." He gestured to his wheelchair. "People see this and think it makes me powerless. They don't realize it gave me time to study, to learn, to prepare." The afternoon sun shifted through the windows as Marcus continued his studies. In the background, a police siren wailed, making him flinch slightly. His mother had warned him about the increasing police presence in their neighborhood, about the rumors of harassment and profiling. He'd seen the worry in her eyes this morning as she left for her shift at the hospital. "Just stay safe," she'd said, straightening his collar. "Your brain is a gift, but sometimes people fear what they don't understand." Marcus had smiled, hugged her goodbye, and promised to be careful. But they both knew that in their world, careful wasn't always enough. That's why he studied. That's why he memorized. That's why he prepared. A message buzzed on his phone, his mother checking in during her break. "Library again?" she texted. "Don't forget to eat lunch." "Always looking out for me," he typed back, smiling. She didn't need to know about the hours he spent studying police brutality cases or the detailed notes he kept about local police misconduct. She carried enough worries already. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus's mind continued absorbing information with mechanical precision. Each case he studied was another piece of armor, each statute another weapon in his arsenal. He didn't know it yet, but in a few short hours, everything he'd learned would be put to the test. Ms. Chen watched him from her desk, pride mixed with concern in her eyes. She'd seen enough in her 30 years at the library to know that knowledge this focused, this determined, usually came from a place of deep necessity. She said a silent prayer that Marcus would never need to use everything he'd learned, but fate had other plans for the young legal prodigy, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, where 3 police cruisers were about to change everything. Officer James Jenkins sat in his cruiser, watching the street with predatory eyes, while his partner munched on a convenience store sandwich. The dashboard computer displayed their productivity numbers for the month. Citations issued, stops made, arrests logged, numbers that determined promotions, special assignments, and most importantly, who got to be part of the unit's special operations. "That spot by the library's been good hunting ground," Officer Reynolds said between bites. "Lots of opportunities for quality contacts." Their code for easy targets, people unlikely to file complaints or have the resources to fight back. Jenkins smiled, remembering how he'd worked his way up from rookie to senior officer in record time. It wasn't about solving crimes or serving the community. It was about knowing which people to pressure, which judges would sign off on flimsy warrants, and which property could be seized and conveniently logged into evidence. The radio crackled. "Unit 417, Chief wants an update on those numbers by end of shift." The unspoken message was clear: quota time. Jenkins keyed his radio. "Copy that. We're on it." In the precinct's break room earlier that day, Sergeant Miller had pulled Jenkins aside. "The civil asset forfeiture numbers are down this quarter," he'd said quietly. "The mayor's office is breathing down our necks about budget shortfalls. Need you to step it up." That's how it worked in the department's specialized street crimes unit. They called themselves the Impact Team, but among the regular patrol officers, they had another nickname, the Tax Collectors. They didn't just enforce the law. They generated revenue. Jenkins checked his watch. 2 hours left in the shift. He needed something to boost those numbers. His eyes drifted to the library, its stone steps visible from their parking spot. They'd had good luck there before, students, immigrants, people who wouldn't want trouble. "Look alive," Jenkins said, straightening in his seat. "Got a possible situation developing." He didn't mention that the situation was nothing more than a disabled black teenager in a wheelchair surrounded by books. But Jenkins had learned long ago that any situation could become profitable if you knew how to work it. What he didn't know was that this particular situation would become the thread that, when pulled, would begin unraveling years of carefully constructed corruption. He didn't know that his next decision would set in motion events that would expose not just his own misconduct, but a system of institutionalized corruption that reached from street level all the way to the department's highest ranks. Reynolds crumpled his sandwich wrapper. "This kid again? Been seeing him at the library lot, always with those books." "Books can't protect you from a good civil forfeiture," Jenkins smirked. "Call in backup? Let's make this official." He keyed his radio, requesting additional units for a suspicious person investigation, the code that gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. As 2 more cruisers rolled in, Jenkins adjusted his body camera, making sure it was turned off. Another trick he'd learned early in his career. The department had policies about camera usage, but policies were just words on paper. And if there was one thing Jenkins understood, it was how to make words on paper work in his favor. What Jenkins couldn't see was that his carefully constructed world of corruption was about to collide with something he'd never encountered before. A mind that understood the law better than he did, and a spirit that wouldn't be broken by the usual tactics. He stepped out of his cruiser, authority radiating from every movement, confident in the power of his badge and the system that had always protected him. The autumn wind carried a chill, but Jenkins didn't feel it. He was too focused on the familiar rush of power, the anticipation of another successful intervention. "Time to go to work," he said to his fellow officers, not realizing he was about to meet his match in the most unexpected form. A teenager in a wheelchair who was about to give him a lesson in law that would change everything. Sandra Williams's hands trembled as she read the text message from Ms. Chen. "Sandra, there's a situation at the library with Marcus. Police. He's handling it, but you should know." Her nursing scrubs suddenly felt too tight, the hospital hallway too narrow. 3 years of protecting Marcus since the accident, and this was the moment she'd always feared. "I need to take my break now," she managed to tell the charge nurse, her voice steadier than her heart. The nurse took one look at her face and nodded. They'd worked together long enough to know Sandra never asked for anything unless it was important. In the break room, Sandra's mind raced through every conversation she'd had with Marcus about dealing with police. "Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Don't give them any reason." The same warnings every black parent gave their children, but with Marcus, everything was more complicated. The wheelchair made him more vulnerable, but his mind, that brilliant, unstoppable mind, could make him a target in other ways. Her phone buzzed again. A video link from one of the library regulars. Sandra's breath caught as she watched her son, surrounded by police cruisers, calmly citing legal precedents while officers loomed over him. Pride and terror warred in her chest. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "Not like this." The memory of their last conversation that morning played in her mind. Marcus had been absorbed in his legal texts, making notes about civil rights violations. She'd asked him why he spent so much time studying these particular cases. "Because knowledge is protection, Mom," he'd said, his eyes carrying that old soul wisdom that sometimes frightened her. "And somebody has to stand up. Might as well be the person they least expect." A text from her friend James, a civil rights lawyer she'd known since college, lit up her phone. "I'm 5 minutes from the library. Got the alert from Community Watch. Want me to check on Marcus?" Sandra's fingers flew over the keys. "Please, I'm stuck at work." He's quoting laws at them. "That's our boy," James replied. "I'll make sure he's okay." The break room door opened, and Teresa, her closest friend on staff, stepped in. One look at Sandra's face told her everything. "Your boy?" Sandra nodded, showing her the video. Teresa watched, her expression shifting from concern to amazement as she heard Marcus speaking. "When did he get so—" Teresa gestured, searching for the word. "Powerful," Sandra finished. "He's always been. The accident just gave him a focus." She stood, straightening her scrubs. "I should be there with him." "He's handling it," Teresa said softly. "Look at him. He's not afraid. That's what scares me," Sandra whispered. "He's 17, brilliant and black in America. That's a dangerous combination." Another text from James. "Almost there. Marcus has them on their heels. He's citing Section 1983 violations. Your boy's not just smart, he's strategic." Sandra sank back into her chair, remembering the nights after the accident. Marcus, lying in his hospital bed, hadn't cried about never walking again. Instead, he'd asked for books, legal books. "If I can't run from trouble," he'd told her, "I'll learn to face it on my own terms." She'd worked extra shifts to buy those books, wondering if she was feeding an obsession. Now, watching the video again, she realized she'd been helping him build armor instead. The charge nurse appeared in the doorway. "Sandra, your lawyer friend just called the unit. Says everything's under control at the library. He's with Marcus now." Relief flooded her system, followed immediately by a new fear. This wouldn't be the end. Officers like that, who'd been so openly aggressive, wouldn't just walk away. They'd want revenge. Her phone buzzed one final time. A message from Marcus. "I'm okay, Mom. Miss Chen saved all my books. And Mom, I think it's time. Time to do what we talked about. Time to change things." Sandra closed her eyes, knowing her son was right. The moment they'd prepared for had arrived. Tonight, they'd begin the fight that might change everything. Not just for Marcus, but for every vulnerable person in their community who'd ever faced abuse of power. "Be safe," she texted back. "I'll be home soon. We'll talk." But they both knew the conversation was just a formality. The real work had already begun. Marcus's room looked like a war room by midnight. Papers covered his desk, each one a piece of the puzzle he'd been unconsciously assembling for years. News clippings about police misconduct, carefully documented dates of suspicious arrests around the library, and printouts of civil asset forfeiture records he'd obtained through public information requests spread across every surface. James Washington, still in his suit from court, leaned against the doorframe. "You've been preparing for this for a while, haven't you?" "Since I first noticed the pattern," Marcus replied, wheeling to his filing cabinet. "Every Thursday like clockwork. They target someone vulnerable near the library, usually students. Immigrants, disabled people, always the same officers, always the same approach." He pulled out a thick folder labeled Impact Team Incidents and handed it to James. Inside were dozens of witness statements he'd collected, each one meticulously dated and notarized by Ms. Chen. The librarian had been more than just a friend. She'd been his silent partner in documentation. "Last month, they harassed Mrs. Garcia's son," Marcus continued, pointing to a recent statement. "A deaf college student. The month before that, it was Mr. Chen's daughter, international student, scared of losing her visa. They know exactly who to target." Sandra appeared with fresh coffee, her hospital scrubs replaced by comfortable clothes, the worry lines around. Her eyes had hardened into something else, determination. "Show him the patterns you found in the asset forfeiture data." Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. Every victim reported cash or valuables seized. But here's the interesting part. He highlighted a column. Only about 60% of these seizures were ever officially logged into evidence. The rest just disappeared. James whistled low. "That's not just harassment. That's organized theft under color of law." He paused, studying Marcus. "You know they're going to come after you for this. People like Officer Jenkins, they don't like being exposed." "Let them come," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "Every move they make against me now just adds evidence to the pattern." He pulled out another folder. "I've already identified 12 other victims willing to testify. They were just waiting for someone to take the first stand." Sandra touched her son's shoulder. "Ms. Chen called. She says the library's security cameras caught everything today. She's made copies of the footage. And I've got the body cam footage request forms ready," Marcus added. "Plus, 3 witnesses from the library already emailed me their cell phone. Videos. We're building a wall of evidence they can't ignore." James began pacing, his lawyer's mind racing. "We need to move fast, file the initial complaints before they can start their cover-up. But we also need to be strategic. One wrong move, and they'll bury this in procedural hell." Marcus wheeled to his bookshelf, pulling out a heavily annotated copy of federal civil rights statutes. Already mapped out the strategy. We filed simultaneously at multiple levels. Department Internal Affairs, Civilian Review Board, State, Attorney General's Office, and Federal Civil Rights Division. Make it too big for them to sweep under the rug. His mother's phone buzzed, a text from Teresa at the hospital. "Sandra, you need to see this. Officers asking questions about you at the hospital, being real specific about your schedule." Sandra's face tightened, but Marcus was already pulling out another folder. "Expected this too. Mom, remember those harassment documentation forms I asked you to keep? Time to put them to use." James read the room, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're not just building a case against today's incident. You're going after the entire system of harassment and corruption." "The library incident isn't the story," Marcus confirmed, his dark eyes intense. "It's just the key that's going to..." Unlock everything else. These officers have been operating like this for years because nobody they targeted had the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. He gestured to the wall of evidence around them, but everything they saw as a weakness, my wheelchair, my age, my race, actually gave me the time and motivation to build this case. They never saw me coming because they didn't think someone like me could be a threat. Sandra's phone buzzed again. More texts from the hospital about police presence. Marcus noticed his mother's worried glance and wheeled to her side. "Mum, remember what you taught me about how change never comes easy?" She nodded, squeezing his hand. "I just didn't expect it to come so soon." James was already on his phone, activating his legal network. "I'll have protection orders drawn up by morning. And, Marcus, get ready. Once we file these complaints, there's no going back." Marcus looked at his wall of evidence, years of preparation coming down to this moment. "Good," he said quietly, because going back was never an option. Morning light filtered through the library windows as Marcus meticulously arranged his documents before Ms. Chen and James. The familiar smell of books and quiet whisper of turning pages calmed his nerves as he prepared to explain his legal strategy. "First," he said, sliding a document forward, "we file under Section 1983. That's our backbone. But here's where it gets interesting." He pulled out a complex flowchart he'd created. "We're not just filing about yesterday's incident. We're using it as a gateway to expose the pattern." Ms. Chen adjusted her glasses, studying the diagram. "These dates, I remember each incident. Mr. Zhang's daughter, the Rodriguez boy, Sarah from the community college." "Exactly," Marcus nodded. Each case alone seemed isolated, but together, his fingers traced the connections he'd mapped. "They show a clear pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals near the library. And that's just the beginning." James leaned forward, his legal experience recognizing the sophistication of Marcus's approach. "You're building a RICO case, aren't you? Using the asset forfeiture discrepancies to establish a pattern of organized criminal activity." A slight smile crossed Marcus's face. "The missing evidence logs create a paper trail. Every disappeared seizure is a brick in our foundation. But watch this." He wheeled to his laptop, pulling up a calendar. "Notice anything about the timing of these incidents?" Miss Chen's eyes widened. "They all happened near the end of each quarter, when department budget reports are due," Marcus confirmed. "We're not just dealing with random corruption. This is systematic, quota-driven targeting of vulnerable citizens. For departmental profit." The library doors opened, and Sandra entered with Teresa from the hospital. Both women carried thick folders. "Got the harassment documentation you asked for?" Sandra said. "Teresa helped me gather statements from other hospital staff about police intimidation tactics." Marcus added these new documents to his array. "Now, we have evidence of retaliation too. Every piece strengthens the pattern." He pulled out a fresh legal pad, beginning to write with precise, measured strokes. "Time to draft the initial filing." James watched in amazement as Marcus crafted legal arguments with the skill of a seasoned attorney. No wasted words, no emotional language, just clear, compelling legal reasoning backed by meticulous citation of precedent. "Your citations?" James murmured. "These aren't just from textbooks. You're pulling from recent circuit court decisions." "Been reading the law blogs every night," Marcus replied without looking up. "Tracking trends in civil rights decisions across different circuits, building arguments that align with the current judicial mood." Ms. Chen quietly placed a hand on Sandra's shoulder, seeing the mix of pride and worry on the mother's face. They both watched Marcus work, his mind moving with machine-like precision through complex legal concepts. A small commotion at the front desk drew their attention. Two internal affairs officers were showing their badges, asking questions about yesterday's incident. Marcus didn't even pause in his writing. "Right on schedule," he said calmly. "They'll try to control the narrative early, but we're already ahead of them." He handed James a sealed envelope. "This contains time-stamped copies of all our evidence, already filed with 3 different agencies. Whatever story they try to..." Spin, the truth is already in the system. James shook his head in admiration. You didn't just prepare for the legal battle, you prepared for the bureaucratic war too. Had to, Marcus replied, finally looking up. The law is only part of the equation. Understanding how the system tries to bury these cases is just as important as knowing the statutes. Sandra moved to her son's side, reading over his shoulder. This introduction, it's perfect. Clinical enough for the court, but clear enough for the media to understand. Because this fight has to happen in both arenas, Marcus explained. The courts and the court of public opinion. We need the legal system for justice, but we need public awareness for change. The internal affairs officers were getting closer to their corner. Marcus calmly began gathering his documents. Ms. Chen, remember where we discussed hiding the backup? Copies, the librarian nodded. In the archive room under Revolutionary War historical documents. Nobody ever checks there. Marcus smiled, a hint of steel in his eyes. Then let's give these gentlemen their interview. Everything's already in motion anyway. He looked at his mother and James. Ready? They nodded, taking their positions around him like a protective wall. As the officers approached, Marcus straightened in his wheelchair, every bit the legal prodigy about to take on a corrupt system. Gentlemen, he said clearly, I've been expecting you. Shall we discuss yesterday's violation of civil rights statutes? Sandra stared at the termination letter in her hands trembling not with fear but with anger. After 15 years at Metropolitan Hospital, they'd found sudden irregularities in her documentation, the timing just 3 days after. Marcus filed the complaints, wasn't lost on anyone. They're trying to break us financially, Marcus observed, his voice cold as he added the termination letter to his growing evidence file. Classic pressure tactic, but they didn't do their homework. He held up another document, a whistleblower protection filing he'd submitted the day before they fired Sandra. Teresa burst through their front door, still in her nursing scrubs. The whole nursing staff is walking out. We've got 30 signatures, already on a statement about police harassment at the hospital. They can't fire everyone. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. His mother had spent years building relationships, helping others, creating the very network that was now rising to defend her. The corrupt officers hadn't counted on community solidarity. But the pressure wasn't just economic. Officer Jenkins and his team had become a constant presence in their neighborhood. Cruisers parked outside their house at night, spotlights accidentally shining into Marcus's bedroom window as he tried to sleep. Anonymous calls to their landlord about suspicious activity. Each incident meticulously documented, each act of harassment another brick in the wall of evidence Marcus was building. They're watching the library too, Ms. Chen reported during their daily strategy call. 2 plainclothes officers spent hours browsing the law section, taking pictures of book titles. Let them, Marcus replied. Every photograph, every surveillance hour, every act of intimidation, it all proves consciousness of guilt. They're building our case for us. The local news had picked up the story, though their first coverage attempted to paint Marcus as a troublemaker questioning why a teenager spent so much time studying law. But Marcus had been ready for that too. The next day, videos surfaced from dozens of library patrons, showing him helping elderly residents with legal forms, assisting students with civil rights research, offering free legal advice to immigrants. Worried about their status, the community remembers who stood with them, he told the reporters, who came sniffing around for a follow-up story. Now they're standing with us, but the strain was showing. Sandra caught Marcus up late one night, rubbing his temples surrounded by legal papers. The weight of carrying so many hopes, so many stories of injustice, pressed down on his 17-year-old shoulders. Maybe we should back off, she suggested softly. We could move, start fresh somewhere else. Marcus wheeled around to face her, his eyes fierce. That's exactly what they want. Every family that leaves, every victim who gives up, lets them keep their power. We're not running. His phone buzzed. Another message from a victim of police harassment. wanting to add their story to the case. The file of testimonies grew daily, each one a thread in the tapestry of corruption Marcus was weaving into evidence. James arrived with takeout dinner and news from the legal front. Internal affairs is splitting at the seams. 2 investigators came to me privately, wanting to share files. They've been sitting on evidence of corruption for years, too afraid to move. The wall of silence is cracking, Marcus observed, adding notes to his case file. Fear kept everyone quiet, kept them isolated, but they're not isolated anymore. Outside, another police cruiser rolled by slowly. Inside, Marcus didn't even look up from his work. The intimidation that was meant to break them had instead hardened their resolve, transformed their small apartment into a command center for a growing movement. Sandra watched her son work, remembering the frightened boy in the hospital bed after. The accident, the way he turned his pain into purpose. They thought the wheelchair made you vulnerable, she said softly. Marcus glanced at the cruiser through the window, then back to his mother. They thought a lot of things. That's why they're going to lose. The pressure was mounting, but so was the support. For every act of intimidation, the community responded with an act of solidarity. For every attempt to silence them, more voices joined their cause. The corrupt officers had wanted to make an example of Marcus, and they would succeed, just not in the way they intended, because Marcus wasn't just fighting back. He was teaching others how to fight too. The video hit social media at exactly 9 a.m., not the shaky cell phone footage of Marcus's confrontation with the officers, but something far more powerful. A carefully edited compilation showing dozens of similar incidents outside the library. Over the past 2 years, each one meticulously dated and annotated with relevant legal violations. Trending nationwide, Teresa announced, watching the view counter climb. 20,000 shares in the first hour. The hashtag, "Do Justice for Marcus," is taking off. Marcus had spent days editing the footage with a local film student, making sure each clip told its story clearly. The final sequence showed him in his wheelchair, looking directly into the camera. This isn't about one incident. This is about a pattern of corruption that targets the most vulnerable members of our community. And we have the receipts. By noon, national news outlets were picking up the story, not just about the police harassment, but about the teenage legal prodigy who'd spent years building an airtight case. Local reporters who'd initially dismissed the story now crowded outside their apartment seeking interviews. Your strategy worked, James said, scrolling through his phone. Civil rights organizations are reaching out. They want to file amicus briefs. The ACLU is offering support. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. The timing was crucial. Release the evidence publicly, right when Internal Affairs thinks they've contained the situation. He pulled up another document on his laptop, and now, while everyone's watching, his finger hit send on an email containing detailed evidence of the department's missing asset forfeiture funds. Within hours, Nan police theft was trending alongside. Justice for Marcus. The police department's social media response was clumsy and defensive, exactly as Marcus had predicted. Each attempted justification was met with more video evidence, more testimony, more documentation. The digital army that formed around Marcus's cause fact-checked every police statement in real time. They're still using their old playbook, Marcus explained to a group of online activists who'd offered support. They're used to controlling the narrative through traditional media, but they don't understand how digital evidence works. Every deleted tweet, every edited statement, we're archiving it all. Sandra watched her son coordinate with social media teams across the country, turning his legal knowledge into shareable content that explained complex laws in simple terms. The wheelchair that officers saw as a weakness had given him time to master not just the law, but the tools to spread the truth. Look at this, Teresa said, showing them her phone. Other victims of police harassment across the country were sharing their stories, using Marcus's evidence-gathering techniques as a template. Receipts Ready became a rallying cry for documenting abuse of power. The department's Internal Affairs Division, overwhelmed by the digital exposure, called an emergency press conference. But Marcus had anticipated this too. As the police chief began speaking, thousands of social media users simultaneously posted evidence contradicting each of his claims, time-stamped and cross-referenced. They thought they were fighting one teenager, James observed, watching the online storm grow. Instead, they're facing a nationwide movement that knows how to gather and preserve evidence. Marcus wheeled to his window, watching satellite trucks set up for evening news broadcasts. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from civil rights organizations, legal experts, and supporters offering help. But among all the notifications, one message stood out. From a young woman in a wheelchair. "In another state, watching you fight back taught me how to fight too. I'm starting my law degree next year." Legal genius of representation. Sandra saw her son's eyes soften as he read the message. "That's what they really should have feared," she said quietly. "Not just your knowledge, but your ability to share it." The police cruisers still drove by their house, but now they were followed by dozens of phones recording their every move. Citizens had learned from Marcus. Evidence was power. "We've got live streams set up around the library," Teresa reported. "Every patrol car, every officer interaction, everything documented and archived." Marcus turned back to his laptop, where another compilation video was rendering. This one detailed the pattern of financial discrepancies in the department's asset forfeiture program, overlaid with relevant statutes and court decisions. "The truth doesn't need protection," he said, typing out the video's caption. "It just needs exposure." Outside, more news vans arrived. Inside, Marcus continued his work, knowing that every tweet, every share, every new piece of evidence added to the digital wildfire spreading across the country. The revolution wouldn't be televised. It would be tweeted with receipts. The police union's press conference was a masterclass in character assassination. They painted Marcus as a manipulative agitator, questioning how a teenager could afford such a sophisticated legal campaign without outside radical funding. They dug into his past, twisting the car accident that left him disabled into insinuations about reckless behavior. A 17-year-old high school student spending his days studying law instead of attending classes. The union spokesperson questioned, "What kind of teenager does that? We need to ask ourselves what's really going on here." Marcus watched the broadcast from James's office, his expression unchanging. He'd predicted this response, prepared for it, but Sandra's hands clenched into fists as they attacked her son's character. "They're trying to split the community," Marcus explained, wheeling to his evidence wall. "Create doubt, make people question their support." He pulled out a fresh folder. "But they made 3 crucial mistakes in that press conference. 3 demonstrably false statements that just gave us grounds for a defamation suit." James was already drafting the legal response, but the damage was spreading. Local businesses that had supported them began receiving visits from health inspectors and tax auditors. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services questioned Sandra's fitness as a mother, citing Marcus's irregular education. "They're using every bureaucratic weapon they have," Teresa reported, bringing news from the hospital. Even former colleagues were starting to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. The police department filed their own lawsuit, alleging Marcus's social media campaign amounted to tortious interference with police operations. The filing was thick with technical language and procedural complexities designed to drain their resources. "They think they can bury us in paperwork," Marcus observed, already breaking down the lawsuit's weaknesses. "They're used to overwhelming people with legal complexity." He smiled slightly. "But they don't realize complex legal analysis is literally my hobby." Still, the pressure took its toll. Their landlord, citing anonymous complaints, gave them 30 days to vacate. Former supporters stopped returning calls. The local news ran stories questioning the real agenda behind Marcus's campaign. Maybe, Sandra started one evening, watching her son work late into the night. Maybe we should consider their settlement offer. Get your college fund back, move somewhere quiet. Marcus wheeled around, his eyes intense. Mom, remember what you taught me after the accident, about how people will always try to make you doubt yourself when you're fighting for what's right? She nodded, remembering those hospital room conversations. They want us to feel isolated, Marcus continued. Want us to think we're losing support. But look at this. He pulled up his laptop, showing her private messages from dozens of other families. People sharing similar stories, offering evidence, building their case stronger. For every business that pulls away publicly, 2 more are helping us privately, he explained. For every person they intimidate into silence, 3 more start documenting police misconduct in their own neighborhoods. The police union's lawsuit backfired spectacularly when Marcus's response went viral. He broke down their legal arguments in simple, shareable graphics, turning complex legal concepts into easily understood examples of bureaucratic intimidation. They're using the same playbook they've always used, he told his online supporters. But we're not playing by their rules anymore. We're writing new ones. James arrived with news from the courthouse. They tried to get a gag order, claim you're interfering with official investigations. Judge threw it out, said your legal analysis is protected speech. Even as the system pushed back, cracks were showing. Internal affairs investigators, impressed by Marcus's meticulous documentation, began reaching out quietly. Retired officers sent anonymous tips about similar patterns in other precincts. They thought attacking my character would make people question the evidence, Marcus said, adding another document to his filing. Instead, it's making them look closer at why they're trying so hard to discredit a teenager in a wheelchair. Sandra watched her son work, remembering the quiet boy who'd once hidden his brilliance. The system's attempts to break him had only revealed his true strength. Outside, another police cruiser rolled by, cameras clicking. Inside, Marcus continued building his case, each attack providing new evidence, each attempt at intimidation proving his points about systemic abuse of power. They still think this is about that one confrontation at the library, he told James, as they prepared another filing. They don't understand. That was just the key that unlocked everything else. Every move they make against us now just adds another chapter to the story. The system was fighting back with everything it had, but it was fighting the last war, using old tactics against a new kind of resistance. And Marcus, the teenager they'd dismissed as an easy target, was teaching a masterclass in how to turn their own system against them. The basement of Mount Zion Baptist Church was an unlikely command center for a revolution, but at midnight, as Marcus wheeled down the ramp installed years ago for elderly parishioners, he found exactly what he'd been hoping for: allies from inside the system itself. 3 police officers, still in uniform but without badges or nameplates, sat waiting. Beside them, 2 internal affairs investigators and a precinct clerk fidgeted nervously. Pastor Johnson, who'd arranged the meeting, stood watch at the door. We've been documenting things for years, the senior officer spoke first, sliding a USB drive across the table. But nobody would listen until you came along. Marcus plugged the drive into his laptop, and his eyes widened. Internal emails, doctored evidence logs, unofficial quotas, years of data that confirmed everything he'd theorized and more. They've got a name for it in the department, another officer added. They call it taxation by citation, target vulnerable people, seize assets, make the numbers look good for budget reviews. The precinct clerk spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. I've been copying evidence room logs for 3 years. The discrepancies, they're not mistakes, they're systematic. One of the internal affairs investigators leaned forward. We tried to investigate back in 2021. They buried our findings, transferred everyone on the case. But we kept our copies. Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, organizing and cataloging each new piece of evidence. His mother always said truth was like a puzzle. You just needed enough pieces to see the whole picture. There's more of us, the senior officer continued. Good cops who hate what's happening, but they've got families, mortgages. One wrong move, and they're assigned to night shifts in the worst areas. Pastor Johnson moved from the door. That's why we're meeting here. Church basement doesn't have cameras. No one questions cars in a church parking lot at night. The network grew over the next few weeks. Each meeting brought new whistleblowers, new evidence. A judge's clerk with records of rubber-stamped warrants. A dispatcher who'd kept logs of suspicious call patterns. Even a janitor from the evidence room with photos of missing inventory. Marcus created secure channels for each source, using his technical skills to protect their identities. Every piece of evidence was encrypted, backed up, and distributed to trusted holders, lawyers, journalists, civil rights organizations. They're building a case against you, one of the internal affairs investigators warned during a late-night meeting. Planning to plant evidence. Claim you're part of some radical group. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. Let them try. We've got a dead man's switch now. If anything happens to me or my family, everything goes public. Every name, every incident, every corrupt dollar. The underground network evolved beyond just gathering evidence. When Marcus needed to move his mother to a safe house, off-duty, officers provided security. When they needed to transfer documents, church ladies carried them in their Bible study materials. This is bigger than just police corruption, Marcus explained to James during a strategy session. It's about how power works, how systems protect themselves, and how they never expect resistance to come from the people they've underestimated. The network's most valuable asset wasn't just the evidence. It was the change in perspective. Each whistleblower who stepped forward inspired others. The wall of silence was crumbling, not with a crash, but with countless small acts of conscience. You know what they really hate, the senior officer told Marcus during one meeting. Not that you're exposing corruption, but that you're showing others how to fight back smart, using their own rules against them. Sandra, who attended every meeting, watched her son become not just a legal advocate, but a leader. The wheelchair that some saw as a weakness had become his command chair, the position from which he coordinated a growing army of truth-tellers. "Remember what you said about chess?" she asked him one night, as they left another meeting. "About how the most powerful pieces aren't always the most important?" Marcus smiled, understanding. The pawns were turning the game, one principled move at a time. The basement meetings continued, each one adding new pieces to the puzzle. The system had taught these people to stay quiet, to look the other way. But Marcus had shown them something more powerful than fear. The strength of coordinated resistance. They're watching for big moves, he told his growing network of allies. They're not ready for 1,000 small ones. And in the church basement, under the cover of night, those small moves were adding up to something revolutionary. Marcus sat in his wheelchair at the library steps, exactly where this had all begun. His law books were spread across his lap, but this time they weren't just for study. They were bait. "Everything in position?" he asked quietly into his phone. "All." "You set," James confirmed. "News vans are staged 3 blocks away. Legal observers in place. Social media team ready." The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the library entrance. Marcus had chosen this time carefully. Shift change for the impact team, when Officer Jenkins would be most likely to take the bait. "Mom," Marcus whispered into his phone. "I'm here, baby," Sandra replied from her position inside the library. "Ms. Chen has the security cameras running. Teresa's got the hospital staff on standby to document any accidents if they try to take you in." Marcus adjusted his collar, where a tiny microphone captured every sound. The underground network had provided tactical information about Jenkins's usual patterns. The corrupt officer couldn't resist an easy target, especially when he was angry, and Marcus had made sure he was very, very angry. That morning's social media blast had been precise. Evidence of Jenkins's involvement in missing evidence, with just enough details to make him nervous, but not enough to trigger an immediate arrest. The kind of evidence that would make a corrupt cop want to silence its source. Right on schedule, 3 police cruisers rounded the corner. Marcus began packing his books slowly, making sure to fumble a few papers, appearing vulnerable, distracted. Target. Approaching, came the whisper through his earpiece. Their own network of observers tracking police movements. Jenkins emerged from his cruiser, face tight with barely controlled rage. 2 officers flanked him, hands near their weapons. They thought they were running their usual intimidation play. They didn't realize they were walking into a carefully choreographed trap. "Well, well," Jenkins called out, his voice carrying for the hidden microphones. "Look who's still causing trouble." Marcus looked up, the picture of innocent surprise. "Officer Jenkins, I was just studying. Is there a problem?" "Problem?" Jenkins advanced, exactly as predicted. "The problem is you running your mouth about things you don't understand." "Like the missing evidence from last month's raids?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or the pattern of illegal seizures dating back 3 years? Jenkins's face darkened. Hook set. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Jenkins moved closer, his fellow officers spreading out to block potential witnesses. "Think your little wheelchair and your law books make you untouchable?" Marcus began recording on his phone, openly, obviously. The perfect provocation. "I think the 4th Amendment makes me untouchable," Marcus replied calmly, "just like it should. Have protected Mr. Chen's daughter, Mrs. Garcia's son, and all the others you've harassed." Jenkins snapped, exactly as planned. He grabbed Marcus's phone, throwing it aside. "Let's see how smart you are down at the station. We've got some questions about your involvement in a drug investigation." "Plant the evidence now or later?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying clearly for the microphones. "Like you did with Sarah Johnson last year?" The other officers shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't known about that case. "You've got quite an imagination, kid," Jenkins growled, reaching for his handcuffs. "Maybe sometime in a cell will teach you to keep your mouth shut." "Before you do that," Marcus said calmly, "you might want to read this." He held up a court order, freshly signed. "It's called an injunction. See, I filed it this morning detailing exactly how you'd respond to this morning's evidence release, including the false drug charges you're about to try to pin on me." Jenkins froze, finally sensing the trap. "Your supervisor is already reading his copy," Marcus continued, "along with the full evidence file we've assembled. Every case you falsified, every illegal seizure, every victim's statement. The FBI agent who's been watching this whole interaction is probably calling it in right now." As if on cue, dark sedans with federal plates pulled up. News vans appeared from side streets. Legal observers emerged from nearby buildings, cameras rolling. "You played right into it," Marcus said softly. "Just like you've played into every trap I've set over the past month. Each time you tried to intimidate me, you just gave us more evidence. Each threat, each false charge, each attempt to silence me, all documented, all part of the pattern." Jenkins's face went from red to pale as he realized the full scope of what had happened. He wasn't the hunter. He'd never been the hunter. "The real question," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly for all the cameras now recording, "is whether you'll be the first to turn state's evidence, or if you'll let your fellow officers beat you to it. Because right now, in rooms across the city, they're being shown the same evidence files, and the first ones to talk get the deals." The FBI agents were approaching now, badges out. The other officers had already stepped back from Jenkins, their own survival instincts kicking in. Marcus watched as the man who'd tried to break him was led away in handcuffs, brought down not by force, but by the very law he'd sworn to uphold, and then corrupted. "Chess match," Marcus whispered into his phone, knowing his mother was watching. "Checkmate." The safe house was small but secure, a basement apartment provided by one of the whistleblower officers. Marcus sat in the dim light, his body aching from stress and exhaustion. The adrenaline from Jenkins's arrest had worn off, leaving behind the weight of everything they'd sacrificed. Sandra found him there, staring at his reflection in a darkened window. "Your hands are shaking," she observed quietly. "Just tired," he replied. but they both knew it was more than that. The constant vigilance, the pressure of carrying so many hopes and fears, had taken its toll. His wheelchair, usually positioned for perfect posture, slumped slightly to one side. "The doctor called," Sandra said, sitting beside him. "Your blood pressure is too high. She's worried about—" "I can't stop now, Mom," Marcus interrupted, his voice hoarse. "Jenkins was just the start. The whole department is not your responsibility," she finished firmly. "You're 17. You've done more than anyone could have expected. Maybe it's time to let others carry the weight for a while." Marcus wheeled to his evidence wall, where photos and documents chronicled their journey. His fingers traced the faces of other victims: Mr. Chen's daughter, too afraid to leave her house; Mrs. Garcia's son, who'd lost his scholarship after a false arrest; countless others who'd trusted him with their stories. "Remember what you told me in the hospital?" he asked, not turning around. "After the accident, when I was ready to give up, you said our struggles give us purpose." Sandra moved behind him, placing her hands on his shoulders. She could feel the tension knotted there, the physical price of his mental battles. "I also said, you need to be alive to fulfill that purpose," she whispered. A knock at the door made them both jump. The new reality of their lives. It was just Teresa, bringing food and news from the hospital. "The nurses are organizing a fund for us," she reported, "to help with—" She gestured at their temporary home, the boxes of hastily packed belongings. Marcus nodded absently, already reaching for his laptop. His hands trembled as he typed, and Teresa exchanged worried looks with Sandra. "When did you last sleep?" Teresa asked. "Really sleep?" Marcus couldn't remember. The days had blurred together in a haze of legal documents, witness statements and strategic planning. His body, already dealing with the daily challenges of his disability, was rebelling against the added strain. "I close my eyes, and I see all the ways this could go wrong," he admitted. "All the people counting on us, all the evidence that needs to be protected." A sharp pain shot through his back. Muscle spasms from sitting too long in one position. Sandra noticed his wince and moved to help, but he waved her away. "I'm fine," he insisted, but his voice cracked slightly. "No, you're not," James said from the doorway, having arrived silently. "None of us are, that's the point." The lawyer dropped a newspaper on the table. Their story was front-page news again, but Marcus could barely focus on the words. The letters seemed to swim before his eyes. "You've built something incredible," James continued. "A network of witnesses, whistleblowers, activists, but a network means you don't have to carry it all yourself." Sandra knelt beside her son's wheelchair. "Baby, you've shown everyone the way, taught them how to fight smart, how to gather evidence, how to stand up. Maybe that's enough for now." Marcus looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in days. He saw the new grey in her hair, the worry lines around her eyes, the weight she'd lost from stress. The cost wasn't just his to bear. "One more week," he said finally. "The federal investigation is at a critical point. After that—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sandra heard the concession in his voice. She hugged him gently, feeling his exhausted body lean into her embrace. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm. Inside their temporary shelter, a young warrior finally allowed himself to acknowledge the price of his battle, not in defeat, but in the understanding that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let others help carry the load. His phone buzzed with another update, another piece of evidence, another call for help. For the first time since this began, Marcus let it ring. Captain Sarah Martinez sat across from Marcus in the safe house, her decorated police uniform a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. 20 years on the force had left lines around her eyes, but it was the weight of what she was about to reveal that bent her shoulders. "I've been collecting evidence since 2019, she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Started when I noticed discrepancies in the asset forfeiture reports, but this goes deeper than missing money." Marcus opened the folder with steady hands, his exhaustion forgotten as he scanned the documents. His eyes widened at what he found. Internal memos, surveillance logs, financial records, a complete paper trail leading straight to the police commissioner's office. The impact team wasn't Jenkins's idea, Martinez continued. It was a department-wide initiative. Target vulnerable populations, generate revenue through citations and seizures, suppress any complaints through intimidation. All officially sanctioned, all carefully documented. Sandra, standing behind Marcus's wheelchair, gasped at some of the numbers. These seizure amounts. Millions, Martinez confirmed, and that's just what they reported. The real numbers are higher. They created a parallel system. Official books for the auditors, real numbers for the inside circle. James, who'd been quietly taking notes, looked up. Why come forward now? Martinez's face hardened. Because they crossed a line with Marcus, targeting a disabled teenager trying to destroy his life, his mother's career. It was too much. But mostly, she looked directly at Marcus. Because you showed everyone that fighting back was possible. You gave us hope. Marcus wheeled to his evidence wall, finding spaces where Martinez's documents filled crucial gaps. This proves systematic coordination, not just individual corrupt officers, but a criminal enterprise operating under color of law. Martinez, unfinished. RICO predicates, conspiracy, multiple jurisdictions, everything you need for a federal case. The captain stood, pacing the small room. They're scared, Marcus, really scared, not just of the evidence, but of what you represent. A kid in a wheelchair outsmarted their whole corrupt system, made them look like fools. They'll try to discredit you, James warned Martinez, like they did with the others. She smiled grimly. Let them try. 20 years of commendations. Clean record, multiple medals. I've got my own insurance files stored with my sister in another state. They touch me, everything goes public. Marcus studied the captain's face, seeing the same determination he felt. You understand what this means? Once we file these documents, I've already submitted my resignation letter, she said quietly. Effective immediately. Can't serve a system I'm about to help tear down. Sandra brought coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set the cups down. Will you be safe? Got my own security arrangements, Martinez assured her. But more importantly, I'm not alone. There are others, higher up, waiting to see if I survive coming forward. If we do this right, it'll start a cascade. Marcus was already organizing the new evidence, his legal mind cataloging charges, violations, statutes. This is the missing piece. With your testimony to authenticate these documents, they'll try to settle, James interjected. Offer deals, money, whatever it takes to keep this quiet. Martinez's laugh was bitter. Too late for that. They had years to clean up their act. Instead, they got greedy, comfortable, started thinking they were untouchable, until a teenager in a wheelchair proved them wrong, Sandra said softly, squeezing her son's shoulder. The captain knelt beside Marcus's wheelchair, meeting him at eye level. You know why they're really terrified? Not just because you caught them, but because you showed others how to do it too. Every department in the country is watching this case, wondering if they have their own Marcus waiting in the wings. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what was coming. We'll need to coordinate with the FBI, organize the evidence for maximum impact. Already done, Martinez said. I've been working with them for weeks, building the case. Your evidence was the catalyst they needed. Now mine's the confirmation that breaks it wide open. She stood, straightening her uniform one last time. This is my last act as a police officer, she said formally, bringing evidence of corruption to a citizen who taught us all the true meaning of law enforcement. As she left the safe house, Marcus wheeled to his window, watching her go. The captain's testimony would change everything, but her courage in coming forward had already proven something vital, that within the system they fought, there were still people willing to risk everything for justice. Mom, he said quietly, I think we're going to need a bigger evidence wall. The police commissioner's resignation played on every news channel, his face ashen as he read a carefully worded statement. Behind him, FBI agents were already entering the department headquarters, boxes and hard drives in hand. 7 high-ranking officers suspended so far, James reported, scanning his phone. Internal affairs is being completely restructured. The mayor's calling for a civilian oversight committee. Marcus watched from his wheelchair in their new apartment. Safer now, with the department leadership in chaos. His evidence wall had migrated to a secure server, each document now part of the federal investigation. They're offering settlements to the victims, Teresa added, bringing in the morning paper, starting with the families from Marcus's original case files. Sandra, newly reinstated at the hospital with back pay and a formal apology, sat beside her son. Mr. Chen called. His daughter's visa case is being reopened. They're reviewing every deportation order connected to the impact team. The power shift was happening faster than anyone had expected. Captain Martinez's evidence had cracked the foundation, and the whole corrupt structure was crumbling, but Marcus knew institutional change required more than just removing bad actors. "We need to focus on the reforms," he said, pulling up a document he'd been drafting. "Body camera policies, asset forfeiture restrictions, civilian review procedures. While they're desperate to rebuild trust, we can set new standards." James nodded, reviewing Marcus's proposals. "The federal consent decree will force structural changes. But your recommendations, this is something else. You're not just fixing the department, you're reimagining public safety." The media had shifted too. No longer the story of a teenage legal prodigy fighting corruption, but a deeper examination of systemic issues. Marcus's case had become a template for other communities, a blueprint for accountability. 4 other departments under investigation now, Teresa reported, showing them her tablet. Community groups using your evidence-gathering techniques, building their own cases. Marcus wheeled to the window, watching police cruisers pass below. Different officers now, wearing new body cameras, following stricter protocols. The fear was gone from the neighborhood, replaced by something else, expectation. "The union's breaking ranks," James continued. "Good officers who stayed quiet for years are coming forward, demanding reform from within. They're using your language, citing the same laws you used." Sandra watched her son, seeing not triumph in his face, but focused determination. "What are you thinking, baby?" "About sustainability," Marcus replied. "Changes made in crisis don't always last. We need to build something permanent." He pulled out a new folder, plans for a community oversight training program. "Teaching others what you learned," James asked, reviewing the documents. "Teaching them to teach others," Marcus corrected. "Every community needs people who understand the law, who can document violations, who can organize evidence effectively, not just lawyers, everyday citizens." The phone rang. Another community group seeking guidance. Marcus had been receiving calls from across the country, each one telling similar stories of systematic abuse, each one ready to fight back. "The police academy called," Sandra said quietly. "They want you to help design their new civil rights training curriculum." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "They want the kid who took down their department to train their officers? They want the person who proved that law enforcement only works when it respects the law," James corrected. "Your wheelchair didn't just give you time to study, Marcus. It gave you perspective they desperately need." Outside, a protest was forming, not against police brutality this time, but for continued reform. Marcus recognized faces from his evidence files. Victims turned activists, carrying signs with legal citations he'd taught them. "Channel 4 wants to interview you about the national implications," Teresa mentioned. "And there's a congressional committee asking for your testimony on police reform legislation." But Marcus was focused on his laptop, refining his training materials. "The spotlight's useful," he acknowledged, "but the real work happens in places like that church basement. Person by person, case by case." Sandra watched the protest grow below, remembering her early fears for her son's safety. Those fears hadn't been wrong. The fight had cost them dearly, but as she watched Marcus work, she understood that his greatest protection had never been hiding, but transforming the system itself. The power didn't really shift, Marcus said, almost to himself. It was always there, in the law, in the community. We just had to learn how to use it. James gathered his papers, heading to another reform committee meeting. Ready to build something new? Marcus saved his work, straightening in his wheelchair. Been ready since day one. Let's make sure this time justice isn't just a word in a law book. Marcus sat before the grand jury, his wheelchair positioned perfectly at the witness table. Behind him, the gallery was packed with federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and investigators. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment. The final move that would transform individual victories into systematic change. Please state your name for the record, the prosecutor began. Marcus Williams, he replied, his voice clear and steady. The fear was gone now, replaced by absolute certainty. Mr. Williams, can you explain how you first discovered the pattern of police corruption in your community? Marcus glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly from the gallery. It wasn't a single discovery, he began. It was hundreds of small pieces forming a larger picture. Every illegal stop, every unauthorized seizure, every intimidation tactic, they all followed the same playbook. He reached for the evidence binder, now marked with federal exhibit stickers, the same documents that had once covered his bedroom. Walls were now official grand jury exhibits. The impact team's activities weren't random, he continued, his legal training evident in every word. They were part of a structured system designed to generate revenue through constitutional violations. Their own records prove it. The prosecutor displayed Captain Martinez's documents on the screen. Can you walk us through the financial patterns you discovered? For the next hour, Marcus laid out the case with surgical precision. Asset forfeiture logs, falsified reports, internal communications, each piece connecting to the next, building an irrefutable picture of organized corruption. And these methods, the prosecutor asked, they've been adopted by other departments? Yes, Marcus confirmed. We've identified similar patterns in at least 12 other jurisdictions. The same quota systems, the same targeting of vulnerable populations, the same manipulation of evidence. In the gallery, Sandra watched her son with quiet pride. The teenager who'd once hidden behind law books was now teaching federal prosecutors how to dismantle corrupt systems. Mr. Williams, the prosecutor continued, what do you believe is necessary to prevent these abuses from recurring? This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. He wheeled slightly forward, addressing not just the grand jury, but the entire system. Structural change requires 3 elements, he began. First, accountability, not just for individual officers, but for the command structure that enables abuse. Second, transparency, mandatory reporting, civilian oversight, and protection for whistleblowers, but most importantly, empowerment, giving communities the tools and knowledge to recognize and document violations of their rights. He pulled out his final exhibit, the comprehensive reform proposal he developed with Captain Martinez and other whistleblowers. This isn't just about punishing bad actors, Marcus explained. It's about fundamentally redesigning how law enforcement interacts with the community. Every policy, every procedure, every training protocol needs to center constitutional rights and human dignity. The grand jurors leaned forward, many taking notes. They'd heard from police experts, federal agents, and professional prosecutors. But this 17-year-old in a wheelchair was showing them something different. A path forward. The corruption we uncovered isn't unique to our department, Marcus continued, but the solution we've developed can be universal. We've created a template for community oversight, a framework for reform that can be adapted anywhere. The prosecutor, displayed the results of Marcus's work. Statistics showing dramatic decreases in civil rights violations, improved community relations, even better crime-solving rates where his reforms had been implemented. And what would you say to those who claim these changes make policing more difficult? Marcus smiled slightly. I'd say what I told the police academy cadets last week. True law enforcement isn't about power over communities. It's about partnership. With them, every officer who embraces these reforms becomes more effective, not less. In the gallery, James watched the grand jurors' reactions. They weren't just hearing testimony. They were witnessing the future of criminal justice reform, presented by someone who had transformed his own vulnerability into a source of unprecedented change. One final question, Mr. Williams, the prosecutor said. What do you see as the ultimate goal of these reforms? Marcus paused, thinking of everyone who had joined his fight, the whistleblowers, the victims, the activists who'd learned to use the law as their shield and sword. The goal isn't just to punish corruption or prevent abuse, he answered. It's to create a system where my experience becomes impossible to repeat, where no one, regardless of their race, disability, or status, has to become a legal expert just to protect their basic rights. He gestured to his wheelchair. They saw this as a weakness, something that made me an easy target. Instead, it gave me the perspective and determination to change the entire system. That's what these reforms are about, transforming perceived weakness into strength, fear into power, victims into advocates. The grand jury forewoman wiped tears from her eyes as Marcus finished. In the gallery, federal agents nodded in approval. Everyone present knew they weren't just hearing testimony. They were witnessing the final moves of a legal genius who had turned a single act of harassment into a national movement for change. 6 months after the grand jury testimony, Marcus wheeled through the newly established Community Oversight Center, housed in what had once been the Impact Team's headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same rooms once used to plan. Harassment now hosted training sessions on constitutional rights. Today's class is full again, Ms. Chen reported, walking beside him. She'd left the library to help run the center's educational programs. We've got people from 3 different states here to learn your documentation methods. The main training room was packed with a diverse group. Community activists, local officials, even police officers sent by departments trying to get ahead of their own potential scandals. On the walls, flowcharts showed step-by-step procedures for gathering evidence, filing complaints, and building systematic cases. Start with the basics, Marcus told the assembled group. Document everything. Build patterns. Know your rights, and the exact laws that protect them. His voice carried the authority of experience now, his wheelchair a symbol not of vulnerability, but of perseverance. In the back of the room, Officer Jenny Martinez, no relation to the captain, took notes. She was part of the department's new Community Relations Unit, built from the ground up after the purge of corrupt leadership. The old system treated police accountability like an afterthought, Marcus continued. The new one makes it the foundation. Every officer camera logs directly to civilian servers. Asset seizure requires court approval before, not after. Complaint investigations are conducted by independent boards. Sandra, who now directed the center's victim support programs, watched from the doorway. The transformation wasn't just in the policies, it was in the people. Former victims had become advocates, whistleblowers had become reformers, the wall of silence had been replaced by a culture of accountability. We've got inquiries from 30 more departments, James announced, arriving with a stack of papers. They want to implement your training programs. The DOJ is citing our model in their reform agreements. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. The changes they'd fought for were proving contagious. Each success story, each reform department, each empowered community added momentum to the movement. The key, he told the class, is sustainability. Reform isn't a single action. It's A continuous process. That's why we focus on building systems, not just fixing problems. He pulled up statistics on the screen. Complaint rates down 70%. Successful prosecutions up 45%. Community trust metrics showing unprecedented improvement. But most importantly, civilian participation in oversight at record levels. This isn't just about policing, Marcus explained. It's about civic engagement. When people understand their rights and have tools to protect them, everything changes. Teresa burst in with breaking news on her tablet. Another major city had just announced the adoption of Marcus's reform model. The ripple effects of their local struggle were becoming a national wave. "They're calling it the Williams Protocol," she said, showing him the headline. "Your methods are becoming the gold standard for police reform." Marcus wheeled to the window, looking out at the community he'd helped transform. The streets felt different now. People walked with confidence, not fear. Police officers patrolled with partners from the Civilian Oversight Board. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. "Remember our first meeting in that church basement?" James asked quietly. "When we thought we were just fighting a corrupt unit?" Marcus smiled. "We were thinking too small. The real goal wasn't just to stop specific abuses, it was to make abuse impossible within the system itself." The afternoon training session focused on practical skills, evidence gathering, rights assertion, complaint filing. Marcus moved through the room, helping people understand the legal concepts he'd once studied alone in the library. "Your son," an elderly participant told Sandra, "he didn't just change the police. He changed how we see ourselves, made us understand. We're not helpless." Outside, a police cruiser rolled past, new design, new policies, new purpose. The officers inside waved at Marcus, not out of fear or forced respect, but genuine appreciation. They were part of the new system too, one that protected good officers while making corruption impossible for bad ones. "Next week's advanced class is already full," Ms. Chen reported. "People really want to learn this stuff." Marcus nodded, watching his students practice documentation techniques. "Knowledge is spreading, power is shifting. The system isn't just changing, it's evolving." In his pocket, he carried a copy of the original complaint he'd filed after that first confrontation at the library. It reminded him how everything big started with something small. One person standing up, one document filed, one truth spoken. The revolution they'd started wasn't loud or violent. It was methodical, legal, unstoppable, and it was just beginning. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Officer Jenkins and 11 other former police officials were led in for sentencing. Marcus sat in the front row, his mother on one side, Captain Martinez on the other. This wasn't just the end of their case. It was the culmination of a movement that had started with one confrontation outside a library. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Richardson entered. The judge, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, had overseen every aspect of the case. She'd watched it grow from a single complaint into the largest police corruption case in the city's history. "Before I deliver the sentences," Judge Richardson began, "I want to address something remarkable about this case." She looked directly at Marcus. "We've seen systematic corruption before. We've seen civil rights violations. But we've never seen them exposed and dismantled with such precision and thoroughness by someone so young." Jenkins and his co-defendants sat stone-faced as the judge continued. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Years of illegal seizures, false arrests, systematic harassment, all meticulously documented in Marcus's files and confirmed by Captain Martinez's testimony. The defendants engaged in a criminal conspiracy that betrayed their badges, their oaths, and their community, the judge declared. But their greatest mistake was underestimating a young man they saw as an easy target. The sentences came down like hammer blows. Jenkins, 15 years. The police commissioner, 12 years. 9 other officers, 8 to 10 years each. All their assets seized, their pensions revoked, their careers in law enforcement permanently ended. But it was the judge's final order that truly marked the change. Furthermore, I am mandating the permanent implementation of the Williams Protocol in this jurisdiction. All future law enforcement activities will be subject to civilian oversight, transparent documentation, and immediate accountability. Sandra squeezed her son's hand as the judge continued. The court recognizes that financial restitution cannot fully compensate for the harm done to this community. However, she detailed the multi-million-dollar settlement fund established for victims of the corrupt unit. One by one, victims in the gallery stood as their names were called. Mr. Chen's daughter, her student visa restored. Mrs. Garcia's son, his scholarship reinstated. Dozens of others whose lives had been impacted by the corrupt system, now receiving both justice and compensation. "Mom," Marcus whispered, "we really did it." Captain Martinez, now heading the new Internal Affairs Division, nodded in satisfaction. Her testimony had helped break the case open, but it was Marcus's methodical groundwork that had made it unbeatable. After the sentencing, James gathered them in the courthouse lobby. "The appeals court already indicated they'll uphold the reforms," he reported. "The Williams Protocol is now legal precedent." Reporters clamored for interviews, but Marcus was focused on the faces of the victims and their families. People who had once lived in fear were standing tall, empowered not just by the verdict, but by the knowledge that they had helped change the system itself. "Your son," Captain Martinez told Sandra, "he didn't just win a case. He created a template for justice that's being adopted across the country." The evidence room that had once held Marcus's files was now a public archive, teaching future generations how to document and challenge abuse of power. His methods were being taught in law schools, police academies, and community centers nationwide. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Community members, activists, reform-minded officers. They weren't just celebrating the verdicts, they were celebrating the transformation of their city's relationship with law enforcement. The things they saw as weaknesses. Marcus addressed the crowd. "My age, my wheelchair, my outsider status. Those were actually strengths. They gave me perspective to see what needed changing and determination to make those changes happen." The new police chief, a reformer selected with community input, stepped forward to shake Marcus's hand. "Your work didn't just expose corruption," she said. "It showed us a better way to serve and protect." Teresa arrived with news from the hospital. The healthcare union had adopted Marcus's documentation methods to fight patient rights violations. Other industries were following suit. The ripples of change kept spreading. Back in their old neighborhood, the impact team's former staging area had been converted into a civil rights education center. The same corners where they once harassed citizens now hosted Know Your Rights workshops. "Justice isn't just about punishment," Marcus told a reporter. "It's about transformation. Every department that adopts these reforms, every community that learns to stand up for its rights, that's real justice." Sandra watched her son speak, remembering the frightened boy in the hospital after his accident. He'd transformed his tragedy into purpose, his challenges into strength, his fight for personal justice into a movement for systemic change. Jenkins and his co-defendants were led away to begin their sentences, but their departure wasn't the real victory. The real triumph was in the new systems, new policies, and new relationship between police and community that would outlast any individual case. Marcus wheeled away from the courthouse, his mother by his side, moving forward into a future they had helped create, one where justice wasn't just served, but permanently transformed. 1 year later, Marcus wheeled onto the stage of the law school auditorium, now a freshman on a full scholarship. The audience was filled with faces both familiar and new, community activists, law enforcement officials, and students eager to learn from the young man who had transformed a personal struggle into a national movement. The Williams Protocol isn't just a set of procedures, he began, his voice carrying the confidence of experience. It's a reminder that justice doesn't depend on physical strength or official position. It depends on knowledge, determination, and the courage to stand up when everyone expects you to back down. In the front row, Sandra sat beside Captain Martinez, both women now directing different aspects of the national oversight program that had grown from their local victory. The corrupt system they'd fought was becoming a distant memory, replaced by a model of accountability that was spreading across the country. Last month, Marcus continued, the 100th Police Department adopted our reforms. But more importantly, thousands of citizens have learned to document, challenge, and prevent abuse of power. The knowledge that was once my personal defense has become a community shield. Ms. Chen, still running the library's legal education program, smiled as she remembered the quiet teenager who used to spend hours studying law books. Now those same study methods were part of a curriculum taught in community centers nationwide. The wheelchair they saw as a weakness, Marcus gestured to his constant companion, gave me time to study, to think, to plan. The age, they thought, made me vulnerable, helped me see problems with fresh eyes. Even their harassment became evidence in our case for change. James, now heading a civil rights law clinic inspired by Marcus's methods, watched his former client become a teacher. The legal genius, who had once fought alone, had created a network of informed, empowered citizens who could recognize and challenge injustice. But the real legacy isn't in court victories or policy changes, Marcus explained. It's in the shift of power. When communities understand their rights and have tools to defend them, the entire dynamic of law enforcement changes. Fear gives way to mutual respect. Confrontation becomes collaboration. The evidence wall that once covered Marcus's bedroom had evolved into a digital database, accessible to activists and reformers nationwide. Each documented case, each successful challenge, each reform department added to a growing body of knowledge about how to make justice work for everyone. My mother taught me something crucial after my accident, Marcus said, glancing at Sandra. She said that our challenges don't define us. What we do with them does. The system thought they could silence a disabled black teenager. Instead, they helped create a blueprint for nationwide reform. In the year since the court victory, Marcus had watched his methods spread beyond police reform. Labor unions, civil rights groups, and grassroots organizations were adopting his systematic approach to documenting and challenging abuse of power. The old saying is that justice is blind, he continued, but we've proven that justice needs to be clear-sighted, documented, and accessible to everyone. When we lift up the most vulnerable among us, we strengthen the entire system. The audience included Officer Jenny Martinez and other reform-minded police officers who had embraced the new approach. They discovered that transparency and accountability didn't make their jobs harder. They made their work more effective and meaningful. A year ago, we weren't just fighting corruption, Marcus concluded. We were fighting the idea that some people are powerless, that some voices can't be heard, that some injustices can't be challenged. We proved those ideas wrong, not just for our community, but for every community ready to stand up for change. After the speech, in the quiet of the reception hall, Sandra found her son staring out a window at the city they'd helped transform. "Proud of you, baby," she said softly. Marcus smiled, watching police cars pass by, no longer symbols of fear, but of a reformed system built on respect and accountability. "We really did it, didn't we? Changed everything they thought couldn't be changed." "No," Sandra corrected gently. "You showed everyone else they had the power to change it themselves. That's the real legacy. Outside, the sun set on a different and kind of city where justice wasn't just a word in Marcus's law books, but a living reality shaped by the courage of a young man who had turned his greatest challenges into his greatest strength."